Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Phil Stinson from the Department of Classics, and it is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome our speaker, David Fredrick from the University of Arkansas. Professor Fredrick is the second speaker this semester in our DH faculty seminar. We have two more presentations in March and April. Let me tell you a little about Professor Fredrick, his background and his research interests. Dave Fredrick received his BA and MA degrees from KU in classics, both in classics, right? And his PhD from the University of Southern California. Since 2004, he has been the Director of Humanities in the Fulbright College of the Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Arkansas. He is also an associate professor in the Classical Studies program at Arkansas. His varied research interests include ancient Roman poetry, Roman houses and wall decoration, three-dimensional modeling, game design, cultural theory, gender, lots of things. And we are very excited to have Professor Fredrick here this afternoon to speak to us about his research in game design. Without more, thank you. Take it over, Dave.
Thank you. So I want to thank all you for coming on a day that's really pretty nice here in Lawrence. You can almost play tennis, golf, you know, but thank you all for coming. And I think another thank you I've got to give is to the faculty of KU Classics, Mike Shaw, Ann Shaw, Oliver Phillips, Stan Lombardo, because they were here when, you know, I was a pretty restless, unfocused student at that time, and I think without their guidance I certainly wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now, which is both a whole lot of fun, there's a whole lot of stress in what I do now with game design and sort of merging it with my prior life as a classicist, but certainly without their help it would not happen. So what I'm going to do today in terms of sort of high stress or side of what I do is, because this paper you'll detect it's kind of schizophrenic as I go through it, and that is there's a part A, and that part A is going to be how did we come to do like interactive 3D at the University of Arkansas under the rubric of humanities, how'd that happen. So a little local history, about 5–10 minutes of that. Then I'm going to give kind of a demonstration. A demonstration is going to be really a talk about the placements of representations of Hermaphroditus in Pompeii. And you'll see that a lot of that draws on spatial ways of presenting data spatially that are heavily indebted to games. And also thinking about what that content does in Pompeian houses, which I think is in some ways quite game-like. So it's going to be like a central demonstration, and then we're going to cycle back into what's being done now with games at the University of Arkansas. So it's it's a ring composition, not just completely schizophrenic. So A, B, and back to A. Okay? And so just to give you a little background on this, and what I'm going to try to do anyhow, see if this is going to work for me. It's always dangerous, right, to do something like this. So let me see if I can do it, because this will make it a lot more fun. And so I can kind of do that. Oh, that's going to work great. Okay. So anyhow, and so here's what the outline of what we're going to do. So local history of 3D at Arkansas, embedded paper, which is kind of a test case. And it's a little bit, there's some subsections to that. We'll go from a sort of very schematic representation of a Pompeian house, a more detailed one, and then the most detailed example. And then we'll cycle back in and talk a little bit about game design. You'll see that game design and game thinking permeates the embedded example, so it won't be completely off the tracks. And then current state of what we're trying to do with games and teaching at the University of Arkansas. And so my introduction to doing this was actually going to Ostia Antica outside Rome and doing laser scanning, which was exciting, on a big crane. And our sort of the operator of the GRU, the truck, Marcello, is a kind of artist, as you can see, driving his way through these very narrow doorways of Ostia to get us to on this crane and scanning. You get laser scanning data and it's gigabytes of data. And then you can put that data together and make like point clouds that are very large. And the question to me then, because Ars Antiqua is really, really interesting, my research focus at that point was really Pompeii. So this was kind of my introduction to what might be done with 3D. This is like 2006, 2005, 2007, right in that time frame. And what I rapidly discovered was sort of a problem like this with data. And that is the laser scanning data was so big and so heavy, it was very hard to share, like impossible to share, and very hard to do much real active visualization with it. It presented its own set of problems. And so at that point, thinking about, well, something like this, like real time, can we walk through these places in Pompeii? And that's how the game engine scenario started to unfold. Was I needed some way for my own research to capture these environments, recreate them, and in Pompeii itself, like maybe stick some of the paintings that are now in the Naples Museum, some that are just lost but preserved in watercolors or lithographs or older evidence. How do I start pulling that together to see how things work, which was my research interest. Okay, so that's why Unity, because it offered a real-time environment, a game engine environment in which to do that. And this was kind of the both wonderful and horrifying result of doing that. And that is an interface in which you walk, this is a house in the bed in a very schematic form. You walk into the room, the game engine says, oh, you ran into a little invisible collider, you're in this room, and it loads up all the wall painting on the walls like that are in that room, which is pretty cool. And I was talking to a database to make that happen. This was about 2009. So when that happens, though, you rapidly have a pretty confusing and overwhelming interface, especially for people who are not gamers. And so at that point, I really sort of stopped, because I knew I could make it talk to a database. I knew I could model the environments pretty well. I could put the artwork on the walls, we could explore it that way. But the user interface, I didn't see a clear path to make that very good. So at that point, I really made a decision to start thinking about game design seriously. And so how to use it. It seems like the tool, but finding the tool is not the same as learning what it will do and how it will do it. And especially how do you set up an interface that makes sense to a user. And so at that point I decided I don't know how to do that. I'm going to teach it because I don't know how to do it. And that turned out to be a really smart move because this first time I offered it, I was like instantly full. Like I had only like 8 chairs or something. It was a really small lab. So it filled up immediately. Some kids took it 3 times. There was an enormous interest that was not being met. And what that meant is I got very talented students, right? And I knew I could teach it okay, and I had a research associate who could do the programming side of it, and I could 3D model pretty well. So we didn't do them a total disservice teaching it that way, but what it did was really jumpstart stuff. And then I found myself in the company of very motivated kids about 20 years old to do this. And that really was key. Okay, so and I started reading a whole bunch about game design, like games and education. So it was kind of a crash course. Okay, and so you probably have noticed at this point, I'm using this, like this is not your normal presentation thing. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because this is not a PowerPoint. This is actually made in the game engine Unity. So one of the things that it will do is make a 3D presentation. That's right now you're like, well, it's all been slides so far. But it's about to get 3D, and the reason I wanted to do this, and you're like, why don't you just use like a video? And my personal feeling is that Unity makes interactive applications, and especially in the archaeological viz side of things, there's a lot of discussion of using Unity, and then you get the Vimeo video of what's happening. And I'm like, nah, I don't want to do that. I'll just go off the cliff with this thing, and we'll see if it works. Okay, but it will give you the sense that something interactive is happening, especially when I don't know what I'm doing. Like that nauseating sense of me spinning you all around. And so you'll see how that might work. But it is, in fact, just real live 3D. And I think that's one of the things you can do with Unity is build that kind of thing, like a Keynote or PowerPoint that's, in fact, all 3D. Okay, so let me go ahead and switch over then to now, this is the segue, the undisguised segue into the test case. And so what we're going to do now is, and you'll discover the awful truth right now, and that is, this is actually the paper that I gave at the APA, or Society of Classical Studies, down in New Orleans. And it was a paper about where hermaphrodites are, representations of Hermaphroditus in Pompeii. And it seemed to me that, and this was part of a, like, humoerotica, like humor plus eros, a panel. And I think there's a lot about how these representations work that are like jokes. That is, but serious ones. But their structure has something of a joke-like quality. Where they turn up inside the houses has that kind of structure. To illustrate that, it seemed to me that Unity was a really good tool, like to get at those issues, like how does art play out across space? I don't know if there's a better tool than this one. So that's why I wanted to do it here, is because, so okay, like that, and then we'll cycle back to games. Okay, so here's the thing, is that, the start of this thing is really this sculpture of Hermaphroditus that's in the Palazzo Massimo Museum in Rome. Almost everybody approaches, this is the angle of approach, more or less, to the sculpture, and no one goes that way, right? Because the face aiming this way guides people around the back of the sculpture. And once we go around and sort of cycle around the sculpture, we're going to see what that feels like in 3D, and then discuss sort of the structure, and then look at houses, and see how Unity helps present the argument that way. So it's only slightly modified. So usually it's around the back, and it's pretty slow. And part of what we're getting here is obviously sort of a familiar fetishizing piece-by-piece presentation of what is assumed to be a female body. And visitors of all ages seem to obey this. Like the choreography is pretty strong that the sculpture establishes. There's usually sort of a slowdown at this part. But then around this side, then there's almost always laughter. But it's really nervous, kind of tight laughter at the discovery, not just that this is a intersex creature, a z, not a she, not a he, a z, but that discovery is also a discovery of an erection. And that's part of the nervous laughter part, because think, well, why that? Why the erection? And that really leads people around to the other side to consider what might that sleeping hermaphrodite be thinking about, dreaming about. And so if we think about this in 3D, you can sort of turn around, and you can see I've cheated already a little bit, and that is we could have made a sculpture itself, but that would have been really laborious. And I think without some really good photogrammetry data, not such a great outcome. So I just slapped some photos on top of the square to give you the sense of what it is. And that's another really powerful lesson about using Unity in 3D, is that you don't have to make everything perfect. There's a lot of arguments that can be made with quite schematic representation, as long as you have this sort of, okay, I'm not going to go that way. The face is sort of aiming around this backside, around like that. And obviously I've totally dropped the Palazzo Massimo itself, like we kind of got this prison cell scenario for this hermaphrodite. But really just to get the 3D space. And so around to this side where the surprise happens. And then it's like, why the erection? What's the internal content that's causing the sleeping Z to have the erection? So back around to consider the facial expression. And this will usually lead, and I've seen this happen with many visitors. I've led tours to this museum a lot. And usually it's like, well, okay, I'm reconsidering this now. On first pass, this is like a penetrable part of this scenario. But the erection maybe suggests, oh, that could be turned around. Could that really happen? Could it really be me that could be subject to this? What? And then back around to reconsider the facial expression. So there's usually a good 2 to 3 cycles around the sculpture that happen, more or less like that. And it seems to me we can then schematicize what it's doing in terms of presentation and how it's choreographing movement. We can sort of back off a little bit. And then think about how this sculpture schematically does movement. The moment of approach, well, that's not good. Let's try that again. Moment of approach. Moving around the back side. Moving around the front side. Sort of a situation like that. Then a discovery is made. That's quite surprising to the visitor. What am I seeing? Then circling back again, around to the front, and now this is set up to spiral around and around, which is something you can think about fairly schematically. And it seemed to me in thinking about approaching this, that we could really think about what's a surprise discovery that elicits laughter, that makes you reconsider the pathway you've taken. It's a lot like a joke, it's a lot like humor. And so at this point, to sort of convey that, I fear I have to tell a dirty joke. Okay, so it's coming. So you may have heard this one, or varieties of this joke. So an 80-year-old guy goes to see his doctor as part of his physical, and the doctor's like, well, you're going to need to give me a sperm sample as part of your regular physical. So gives him the jar, sends him home. Guy comes back 3 days, something like that. Shows up with the jar. The jar is empty and clean. And the doc's like, well, what happened? And our 80-year-old says, well, you know, it's not that I didn't try. I tried with the left hand. I tried with the right hand. Asked my wife for some help. She tried left hand, right hand. She tried with her mouth, with her teeth in, with her teeth out. We called in the next door neighbor, Arlene. Arlene came over. She tried. She left hand, right hand, mouth, teeth, teeth in, teeth out. You know, she was really working on it. She even like put it under her armpit. She put it between her legs. Nothing. And the doc's like, whoa, this is weird. You actually called your neighbor over to do this? And he's like, yeah, but we just could not get the damn lid off that jar. Okay, and at that point, it's obviously a joke. It's obviously ridiculous, right? But know what it makes you do. It makes you think about the jar and all the, like, who would use, like, I'm lighting the jar, I've got it, like, it makes you reconsider the whole progress of the setup, the punchline does. And I think the punchline here, the discovery here, makes you reconsider the whole setup. And I think, in fact, that's a lot of what Hermaphroditus does in houses. Once you discover the hermaphrodite, your path through the house is subject to reconsideration as to what it does and the kind of positionality you've been asked to assume. Okay? Now, to me, a joke does that. It says, hey, I'm only a joke. And anyone thinking about, like, the jar between the knees has, like, figured it out. And also, it's a very subtle joke in a certain way because you thought it was all a male thing, right? Right? But note it's a jar, which is sort of coded female. So the substitution, in fact, is sort of a gender switch in that joke. It was very implicit, okay? It's not dissimilar necessarily from what's happening here, sort of the reverse, okay? Now, for me, if you're going to think about gender theory for talking about this, well, maybe it would be smart to think about the transsexual gaze or transgender gaze from Judith Halberstam. And that is that moment of discovery in a film like The Crying Game or Boys Don't Cry, that moment of discovery that says, this character was not the gender I thought. I have to reconsider the whole plot and the whole progress of desire through this narrative to get to that moment in order to understand where the movie might be going now. I think that can be like that kind of thinking, oh, surprise discovery, what's the whole history there? I have to reconsider that. I think that hermaphrodite placement, like what hermaphrodites do and where they are, is something like that inside the spaces of Pompeian houses. Now, if you have a proposition like that you want to make, how do you get at making that kind of argument? I think something like a game-driven space that you can explore is pretty key to that in real time. So we're going to see a couple of examples of that now. And so you also have to remember when something like this is happening, I forgot that happens. It takes me back. Okay, so to being very late to my Greek classes. So if you go to someplace, okay, note that you're being asked to consider the erection. That this creature, this entity, this Z might be excited. Excited for what? How do I figure into that? Which role am I being invited to play? That sort of scenario is in fact being acted out. In a situation like this, never in private. That is, in Palazzo Massimo, like anywhere else where the sculpture would have been displayed. You're not like having this sort of internal dialogue about how this makes you feel, the sculpture, with nobody there. In fact, you're there thinking, what am I thinking about this? And also thinking, what's the hermaphrodite thinking about this or dreaming about this? And you are in front of an audience. And in fact, in the Palazzo Massimo, you really are sometimes an audience like that. Okay, now you can imagine, if you just look at the arm gestures of our school children, the level of anxiety that this sculpture is eliciting, and humor. Okay, so even the sculptors are looking on at that sculpture. So, and to me also maybe useful to consider here is Anne Fausto Sterling's notion that like assessing the exterior marks of gender on the body is almost always an invitation to kind of cycle in and consider the internal identity of sexual desire, which in this particular case is being screwed with pretty seriously, being upset, disturbed. There's no resting point for that truth of internal sexual identity that you're trying to decipher through the outside marks of gender. So I think this Mobius strip that's sort of like sexuality or gender outside being read into internal sexual truth and then back out, it's a very unsteady or repetitively but not fixed process. And I think we can sort of think about that in terms of making our way around that sculpture, which now I'm going to like say that's like making your way to the hermaphrodite inside the Pompeian house. So that's what we're going to do now in 3 examples. And so this will be kind of a scene change here. And we're going to go from the more simple to the more complicated. And in terms of being able to realize a house, like what would you do with Unity to try to recreate these domestic environments, you're going to see sort of 3 stabs at that. And this one's pretty schematic. So there you are at the front door of the house. But the other thing you can do with something like Unity, and I think what makes it useful, is you can start to overlay tools for spatial analysis inside the application. In this case, we're going to keep this to slides, essentially laid on top of this. But you could also use some of this data, which will involve like network topology, like which rooms are better connected to which other rooms, and where's the hermaphrodite, and that whole kind of scheme. You could actually lay that out on the floor or something, like bring it right into the application. So we're going to consider this, and I have to say, in thinking about this question, where are the hermaphrodites in this house? And thinking about that question, I'm quite indebted to an article that just came out by Catherine von Stackelberg on Hermaphroditus in Pompeian House. It's a really good article. And she sort of like breaks down all the typologies and where they are and comes to a conclusion that's not, I think that my conclusion is not at odds with, but we came at it from quite different angles, I think. But still, I think that's a great, great piece, and I have, I definitely benefit from it. So that basic question, where are they? And if you pursue that question, you can start at the sort of macro level, where they're in these houses in Pompeii. So each red, I hope you can see that, it's kind of thin line, but the red outlines are the houses where we have paintings of Hermaphroditus. And then this guy, the blue one, that's where we have a sculpture whose find spot is known. Okay? So now we're just going to say, okay, well that's where the hermaphrodites are in general. And maybe there's like a little concentration up here in the top left, but it's not like you could say like, oh, that's the hermaphrodite neighborhood of Pompeii. You wouldn't draw that conclusion necessarily. It's kind of a scatter. But I think if we don't think about macro location, the ones we're going to look at actually, a little off the edge, but this is the house of the wounded Adonis on the top left. We're going to look at that house, we're going to look at the house of the Vedii, which you see right there listed, and we're going to look at the house of Octavius Cordio. But I think in looking at this, and this we will not do in great detail, because this could, like, network topology and the type of analysis that you could do can be fairly arcane, and I don't think we need to go to quite that level, so we're going to keep it fairly simple. And the basic scenario here is if you just look at them, it looks random. Like each red dot is a representation of Hermaphroditus. On a plan of a house. There's front door, atrium, notablinum in this house, there's a garden, there's the hermaphrodite. Falces atrium, notablinum, there's the garden, there's the hermaphrodite. Falces atrium, there's the, right? So you can start, okay, the red dot is in this house plan, but it doesn't seem like they're always falling in some predictable place. But in fact, they come in 2 categories. That is, ones that are near the front door, in the front part of the house, not deep in the house plan, and those set 2 that are in fact quite deep in the house plan. And once you start looking at that situation, then you can come up with some statistics and say, well, hermaphrodite representations come in 2 flavors, 2 positional situations. One's close to the front of the house, so the depth is pretty to the left-hand side. They're not in like huge distribution nodes. High betweenness means you have to go through that room to get to the other rooms. These are generally not located in that space. And then the eigenvector score is maybe the most like jargon-like word for this. It just means, is it a likely destination? And it's an adaptation of eigenvector scores for like each room is a node and it's a network. The adaptation of that score is what makes Google's page rank. And so a likely place you're going to end up on the web. And so you can think of, oh, I land on a page, I got to go through it, but that's not where the sweet information is. It's one more click. Okay, so maybe that sweet information has only one entryway, one doorway to it, but it's well connected in the overall network. That's a high eigenvector score. Okay, and if you look at this particular set, the ones toward the front of the house, their eigenvector scores are pretty low. Okay, and then that's like group A. If we go to group B, well, their depth is a lot. As you can see, oh, this spatial profile is really different. Depth is high, between is quite low, even lower, eigenvector quite high. Okay, so I'm like, there's like 2 places they show up, in this kind of place and that kind of place. But all of them command pretty good views of the garden area, whether toward the front of the house or the back. So if you add all that together, okay, front part of the house, not an endpoint destination per se, one with a good view of the garden, back part of the house, likely destination, one with a good view of the garden. To me, that added up to a kind of, you could sum that up in a kind of statement. Hermaphrodites punctuate journey to the garden at beginning or end. Okay, so they're either proleptic, like looking forward to your experience in the garden, or they're summarizing. This is what you found out. okay, about how garden spaces work, which is to say they have a lot of erotic danger associated and instability associated with them. Okay? Now, I know, like we're talking about gender theory and hermaphrodites, like where's the unity? Well, in fact, to sort of get at this experience, there is no other tool, I don't think, as good as unity to try to explore this kind of analysis of space. So that's what I think keeps it relevant. And so here for an example of the shallow kind, right? You came into the house, you basically made one turn and then another turn around the atrium, and now you're good. This is the major garden space of the house. Above the door is this painting of Hermaphroditus, which shows one possible reaction in the Roman representations to what you discover. Okay, so satyr comes creeping through the beautiful wilderness, discovers sleeping creature thought to be female, starts pulling off the drapery, makes a surprising discovery, throws up his hand. Oh, not what I wanted to see. Okay? Meanwhile, the hermaphrodite, and it's too bad this doesn't happen in the Palazzo Massimo, right? That the sculptor doesn't wake up. Right? But in the painting, the hermaphrodite wakes up, takes hold of the left arm and wrist of the satyr and says, oh, now come on. It's not that bad. This surprise is not so terrible for you. Okay, so that's one possible emotional reaction, and it's occurring right over the doorway of the entrance to the garden space. Okay? So, another kind of location is in fact very deep in the house. So that one's more like anticipatory, proleptic. This one is at the end of your entire spatial navigation of the house. And we have hermaphrodite on, this is probably a little small. The top hand one, again, this is one of those representations where you're lucky you have it because the wall is completely lost, and this is our best representation of a standing hermaphrodite on the top, right, that you've discovered on the left-hand wall of this top room. Next to it, Narcissus discovers his own reflection. In the bottom, a standing Dionysus discovers a mostly nude from the back Ariadne. Okay, so 3 erotic paintings. And in my opinion, part of what Hermaphroditus does is, in a sense, meta-erotic. It comments upon the rest of the erotic stuff that you discover, underscoring the fact that you have a sort of fluid way of identifying your positionality within that erotic content. So it's not just a question of trying to say, what's Hermaphroditus got to do with Narcissus, or got to do with Actaeon, or got to do with any number of these erotic scenes that are found on Pompeian walls. It's more the question of, ooh, it's like underscoring a possible positionality in response to a lot of that content as a result of your journey through the house, because now you can look back and reflect on the whole thing. And so we're going to now do that very thing inside the house of the wounded Adonis. That is, where do we find the hermaphrodite? What kind of path do we take? So to get at that, what we're going to do is sort of note right off the bat, this is some very fundamental things about Pompeian houses. But they might not, bearing in mind that impluviums are often really damaged and don't have water in them anymore. Right? Fountains are never running now in Pompeii. So their visual effect is hard to know until you go into some kind of virtual space. And now you can see that's really quite a visual draw. So, oh, I'm going to head towards that. What route do I go? Because in between, the atrium was like, well, you got to decide. You know, the impluvium is going to make you go, well, is that way? Is that where I want it? Mm-hmm. So which way do you choose? This is a fundamental question at the start of many houses, like on your itinerary through them. If you choose this one, well, that's kind of narrow and I'm going to lose sight of the fountain. I don't like that. I'm going to go that way, around on this side. And you find you get a pretty quick reward because there's a little garden space to your left. You can then dive in this way, come out here, and you find you're very close to the fountain now and pretty drawn to this particular spot. Once you locate yourself there, you're now on axis between 2 columns with this massive garden painting, very well framed. Okay, so there's like a very short but pretty powerfully stated itinerary. And if you turn around and look, unfortunately this room is really, really damaged. Now, this is the main triclinium dining space of the house, we would argue. Unfortunately, it's not. We have nothing preserved. And so we just sort of have this to work with. So if we turn ourselves around, and this is kind of cumbersome still, if we turn ourselves around, wow, it's really nicely aligned from deep in the space. Okay, and that happens to be a painting of wounded Adonis. So it's by its very nature quite erotic. And the arms of Aphrodite, who's very upset by the wounding and the forthcoming death of Adonis. Now you've also noticed that, oh, I missed a door, I missed an entryway. I'll go in here. And as you move into this space, well, oh, what's that? So we're kind of below this up a little bit. So we chose to go down here. We saw Wounded Adonis. Then we moved into this room, and this is a painting of Hermaphroditus at her toilette. And so Ze is beautifying, and therefore Ze also has a mirror. And so this is this is not that uncommon in Pompeian wall painting. That is, this part, unfortunately, like what we might regard as the key part, is now quite damaged, so hard to tell. But in any case, it's like, oh, that's the Hermaphrodite's reflection right there. Right, so reflection like that, and then your eye is being caught by a figure within the painting. Like, are you interested in what you see? So a question being raised about your level of interest and type of interest in the representation. And then if you go ahead and look out the open doorway, you find that you have that painting again. In fact, if you look this way, it's like Adonis is looking at Hermaphroditus, so there's almost a mirrored relationship between the two paintings that's carried through into the reflection in the mirror over here, and then you're caught by the left-hand figure's gaze outward. So it's really become now very rapidly a quite complex moment in which one erotic painting reflects another erotic. And that's why I would say these Hermaphroditus paintings have a sort of meta-erotic function. And if you were to then consider how you got there, like what happened, and think about it sort of schematically from above, pretty much the path you followed to make this discovery. And now that you're in this, and this is the main dining room of the house, it's a much more intimate reception space. And again, your reaction to the painting is up for assessment. That is, in a Roman context, you would not be alone in this space. And that's very important to remember, I think. So if you're there, what you think about that is part of your social presentation within the space. And it's up for review. And so it's always important to remember, because often when we go through these spaces now, many of these houses are closed, for one thing. So that's another reason why something like Unity is good, because we can get at these spaces in a virtual way, in a way that's still kinesthetic. And it's obviously no substitute. You can see already that, well, it's not like you're actually walking through it in terms of your physical investment, but all the same, it's quite immersive. And I think what's going to happen with some of this stuff is the use of headsets like the Oculus Rift. And especially in conjunction with something like a treadmill, an omnidirectional treadmill, can make this very, very immersive. And so one of the powerful reasons to use this is because these spaces are either closed, highly damaged, and of course, the paintings are gone, so you won't get this experience except in a virtual scenario. Okay, so that's a sort of simple, expression of this. So if we go on to the next scene, this is a more familiar house, but I think that what I'm going to talk about in it is not that familiar. This is the House of the Vedi. Has anyone in the room been to Pompeii? Okay, have you seen the House of the Vedi? You remember it? So it's closed now, and it seems like it's going to be closed forever. They sort of, it's like one of those things, well, in my lifetime, will they reopen it? You don't know. And so beside the door is a very famous painting. And this is a painting of Priapus weighing his manhood against a bag of gold. And they weigh the same. Now that's an interesting thing to put in a doorway, probably not what you have to greet visitors in your house. And so obviously it's a different culture that way. Huh? So what does this say? And the argument has been made, well, this says, it's both phallic obviously, but also it says good luck, good fortune. So this is a very fortunate house. And so this painting is, it's still extant and in situ, so it's very famous. Less famous is a sculpture, statue of Priapus that's now hidden away kind of in the cook's closet in the back room of the house. It's usually behind a locked door. You're very lucky if you get in to see it, and so it's actually piped to be a fountain, which is a nice touch. And so you might be able to guess where this is going. Like, well, if there was a fountain like a Priapus, where did they put it? And the art historian John Clark has made a suggestion of where it goes. And his suggestion is that it's actually right there. So if you're by the front door here, where we were looking, it's across the impluvium right there. And I think if you go ahead and accept his suggestion, which I think I'll raise some questions about this in a second. Let's go ahead and accept it. Okay, well then how does that relate to the Hermaphroditus paintings that are in the house? Is there some kind of visual dialogue going on between them? And know that this would be impossible to test in the real space, because you'd have to pull out the statue, hook it up to the piping, and see what happens. Right? And that's not going to happen. But in a virtual space, we can do that. And so I figured, well, let's just do that. And so you can see, there he is in the distance. ejaculating away, as apparently, according to Clark's argument, he was intended to do. Now, I think there's something here that's also important, and that is, well, what about water anyhow, or these centrally placed fountains, which are very common in Pompeii? You have to remember that the control of water is very much a status issue. That is, the collection, the display of water. These centrally placed fountains are already doing a status announcement action. And to that extent, we could view them as phallic, even if they're not quite as transparently phallic as this particular sculpture. And so I think Clark has hit upon something about how fountains work in Pompeii anyway in terms of gender, even without this particular, really spectacular example. So if we go in, let me do it, and go like that, and well, I'll go this way. In any case, this is very much an attention-getting and orienting, feature. And I think this may be the fact that we can do this, right? And I'm not claiming, this is not the world's greatest piece of 3D art, by a long shot, but it certainly gives you the idea. And, actually how we made this sculpture, it's really pretty scandalous. We did not do photogrammetry. We didn't go there and carefully draw. What we did is we got a pre-made figure out of a place called Miximo. We kind of squeezed it here and expanded it there and did some delicate work in certain areas, and then gave it a sculptural texture, like a marble texture, and we were done. Okay, so to make these kind of mock-up sculptures actually takes about 20 minutes. Now, the thing is, we're testing a theory, you're not making a great artistic statement. This can be done now really rapidly in Unity. And so I think in terms of testing out artistic scenarios, as long as you're not committed to super realism, it's actually really fast in this thing. So anyhow, to me it's like, well, that is like an arrow pointing a certain direction. I will obey Priapus, the traffic cop, and turn right and go this way. And if you've been in this house, this is one of the most highly decorated, this room P. So if we go in this house, we find an erotic repertoire for sure, and that is to say, Pacific E is going to climb inside that white cow to the right. Ixion has already tried to rape Hera, so he's getting tied to a wheel at left, and this is a pretty blurry picture, but you can probably still figure out that's Dionysus standing there over a nude Ariadne, so 3 erotic paintings. But that's not the end of the repertoire in the room. If you then turn this way, you'll see over the door this particular picture. And now that's Hermaphroditus discovered in a landscape. So it's sort of white, but they're sort of schematicized landscape by a satyr figure who again makes the gesture, oh no, I didn't want to discover that. I didn't want to find that out. This is disturbing to me. If you then move in to take a closer view, something very wonderful happens in terms of composition, something you would never discover until you rig this up in 3D space, and that is the gesture of the satyr going, oh no, a penis is matched right, contrapposto and below, mirrored, oh yeah, a penis. And they're about to high-five each other right through the doorway. And so that kind of visual discovery could not have happened without this kind of technology to sort of explore in real time and figure that out. Now, here's the thing. I really want Clark to be right because of this relationship, but I have to be honest, there's not a lot of evidence to support that this is exactly where the sculpture was in terms of the physical piping of the house. So that caveat in place, nonetheless, testing it out is pretty effective through this kind of technology. And then there is, back here, this room is very famous because of the little Cupid paintings that are down in here, but unfortunately the main central paintings have long since disappeared. But if we make our way into here and then turn around, there is again another Hermaphroditus painting. But this one is of the opposite reaction. I think this is important in the repertoire of Hermaphroditus in Pompeii. That is discovered by an aging Silenus, but the reaction is the opposite of the satyr reaction. Instead of, oh no, the arms extended okay. And now there's a gaze into the eyes of the hermaphrodite and even past to the erection and lap. And this seems like it's kind of a love scene. So quite contrasting reaction. And again, if you figure out that's where it is, okay. There's again this visual relationship between the hermaphrodite in the painting now and the Priapus figure posed as a sculpture. And you can sort of reflect on how you got to this place in the house. And we can do that sort of schematically by figuring out the steps that we sort of follow. And I think it's really important that in each case of the rooms that we came to, we kind of had to make this button hook maneuver to discover the painting over a door that leads out. that means you have to turn your back on the space of the room, which is a fundamental sort of statement of vulnerability, especially in Roman culture. So the discovery of the hermaphrodite representation is in its own way sort of an invitation to your own vulnerability, positionally within the room, which is pretty cool, and which we can then think about experientially. And so, as you as visitor, like obviously what's happening partly with this intruded figure is, well, that was you. But now you're like the second you, that would be the other occupants of the room, assessing how you feel about this particular conjunction of content. Okay? So now we're going to take a look at our last example, and this is probably the fullest as far as, because this was extremely schematic for this house, which is incredibly, overwhelmingly, baroquely decorated. And so to capture all that decoration in a house would really be a challenge. And so the next one is the house of Octavius Cordio, which has a sculpture in it that will draw our attention. And that one is, you know, we've done more to capture it, though we have a long way to go, I think. Okay, so typical situation in a Roman house, you got to decide, we'll go this way. And you might wonder about the blank walls in here. And what's happening is this house was under redecoration at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius. And so in fact, these walls were not decorated. And once the aqueduct was bringing water to this house, the impluvium which had served to collect water is now a garden space. Okay, so those two things have happened in sort of the history of the house. And so if you move your way out, and the key thing sort of socially, which is something I should mention here, is that in a Roman house, I suppose one of the most common destinations is the so-called tablinum, which is the sort of reception for clients space. This one has, like, this should be here, but it's a garden. So one of the question marks as you start to explore this house is, where is that reception space? Most people think it's a room labeled, helpfully, F, that is over here to the right. So well, let's go find it. So if you're, for instance, a client visiting the house, that's sort of your quest. And if you turn this way, you'll find that perhaps this is a problem. That would be F right there, but note you're going through a side door, not the front door, and you're on axis with this little side door. I don't think that's where we're supposed to be going, y'all. I think that's maybe, that says to me servile circulation, and I'm not that. So I'm going to bail on that choice. And I'm going to look down and note that there's these little walls. I mean, anyone could hop over them, but they're definitely channeling movement in a sort of labyrinthine pattern around this garden space. And I think that's important because to me, this house is engaged in something very game-like in how it tries to draw you into its more like fictive spaces through our channels, movement, and gaze and discovery. So I'm going to, not that way, I went the wrong way. Okay, fine, I'll go this way. Turn this way. And I can only go this way, so I will. And you find yourself in this room, which is unfortunately really, really damaged, but if we think about its content, there is something recognizable in the, really bad things that have happened to this wall. And that's Hercules raising his club there right in the middle. Bam! So this is the first sack of Troy. Underneath is the second sack of Troy from the Iliad. So very heroic, very masculine sort of cycle of decoration. And if you look out, and we can sort of confirm this this is Clark's analysis of what's on the walls. So you see a bunch of episodes from the Trojan War and Sack of Troy. So if we've got that, and then we turn and look out, well, okay, the house of the Vedii had one very striking phallic statue that we thought maybe was restored correctly on axis with the entryway. If we think of that, like, of these fountains as phallic, we have not just one, but 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the control of water as a sort of like social mastery statement is really articulated right now. And along this axial view, which is very carefully framed, so frame, control, subordination of nature, manipulation of water statement is being made, and you can sort of compare how that's happening with today's view. Okay? Okay, so you've experienced that, and you're like, well, okay, awesome. Now where do I go? I've yet to find this main reception space. I have only one choice now, to go very close to the water, which I think is very interesting. You have to go almost close enough to get your feet wet in this, which of course now you wouldn't have that sense because the fountain, I mean, actually you could still turn it on. It used to be they used to turn on the water in this house, but they don't anymore. So, oh, I'm getting splashed. That's okay. Very interactive. I'll go this way. And as you approach, this in fact is what most people think is the morning reception space of the house, from F. You'll note on the walls, it's kind of dark, and that is one of the drawbacks of using 3D content. It's really sensitive to, like on a screen it looks pretty good, PowerPoint it gets dark. And so you almost have to build varieties of things to get the right level. But anyhow, we can sort of zoom in on this through the slide method. So on the left-hand side of the door is Diana on her knees, on the right-hand side, acting discovery. Right? So that discovery, right, is sort of like the, in a sense, scopophilic or fetishizing gaze turned back on itself or discovered. He's turned into a deer and gets attacked by his dogs. You, as a visitor to this house, two things are being done. One, each painting is supported by a fountain, right? Like it's like fancifully like suspended on these jets of water, which given what you just had to do physically is a very careful touch, I think. And then you have to go right in between the two, almost into their like mythological space to enter the room, like between their gazes. Okay? Let's say you did that. And it was time to, well, okay. I had a question in mind when I came close to this fountain. Where does that water go? And so if you go here, maybe down there, but if your attention is drawn over here, you'll discover, and the guy has a big thing for Ovid. And so Narcissus, reflection of water, Pyramus, and Thisbe. And again, thinking about interactivity and the way this house keeps stepping across the boundary between the real space and the fictive space, if you actually recline on these are couches, I mean they're like made of cement, but they would put cushions on there, this is outdoor dining space. If you actually recline on this dining space, couch, your reflection in the water is an exact double for the reflection of Narcissus' face in the water. So again, another restatement of how you can be drawn into the fictive space. And so, if you then decide to go down to the garden, you'll discover where the fountain comes out from above, where that water is coming out. And it's in this little grotto below. Okay? And if you creep, I promise I don't have like a crawl function to get into that grotto, kind of bend down and look in there. If you do that, you will discover a second depiction of Diana discovered by Actian. And now you have been cast in the acting role, right? Because you kind of have to make the discovery actively, crawl in and discover Diana, and oh, that's now you. Okay, so this house is extremely interactive in that sense. Okay, and that takes us to what we haven't discovered thus far is the Hermaphroditus. So, and one of the things that that needs to happen in the game world is the classical world needs to rise up against the domination of the medieval world in terms of game assets and plants and stuff. So many swords and castles and very few Roman things, but anyhow, so you come down here, and again, the lighting's kind of weird on this ivy, but that's how life is. And the guy is just nonstop. Like, that really does come that far. It would be, and we know there was planning around this, so you have no choice but to go into the portico zone, as if you're about to leave the house. Right, so it's kind of forcing you down to the end of that channel. If you come around the corner, like, oh, well, there's something over there. This is the actual find spot. It's been moved around, now it's in the Naples, like the shed, in Pompeii. So if you go here, you make the discovery. And again, this is really cheesy in terms of, whoa, what? Who's driving this thing? Oh! So a discovery is then made. And note what's happened here. It's like the discovery of the hermaphrodite in the nook of the garden is then doubled by the discovery of the erection in the nook of the drapery. And you've now been cast in a role that you're familiar with from paintings in the other houses. And that is, which kind of discoverer of this sculpture are you? Is that your reaction? Or this looks good, this could be fun. Which, and again, the notion of saying, well, there's a fixed sexual identity there, I think is very problematic in this Roman context. Okay? So, just to sort of sum up this much more complicated sort of scenario in this house, and again, like if you, you made this discovery in the company of probably dining guests. So each one of them sort of looking at each other as to, well, what do you think? What's your reaction? And the puzzle is still, in fact, not solved. Because obviously this is a second walkway. And if you proceed up the second walkway, So that's not a run function. I'd use it if there was. You'd be running in your toga pretty uncomfortable. So let's say you come to this spot. Maybe the biggest spatial joke of all is that. How do you get out? You have no choice but to turn around and retrace your steps. Okay? And so, to me, the house is absolutely brilliant in how it manages this, and a visit to this house on foot today without the ability to explore it in 3D is much less likely to reveal how subtle it is in this respect. So I think the game engine technology is absolutely essential to uncovering some of this play and also thinking about it through play. Okay? So now that we've done that, just to sort of recap what happened here, we started there, we went out there, we made a wrong choice. We went there and said super foul. We went in here and said, oh, I'm getting wet. We went there and said, Actian and Diana. We went there and said, Narcissus, oh, that's really interactive. Went down there and said, that's super interactive, I'm Actian. Went down there and said, I've discovered a hermaphrodite in the bushes. What in the heck? What a surprise that is. How am I supposed to feel about that? Then you try to leave. Oops. Okay, so it's really something that's going on in this house. Okay, that's the embedded sort of example of why 3D technology or real-time exploration for this type of environment. Now what we're going to do is sort of segue back to the conclusion of this thing, which is what we do now with games at the U of A. And go there. And so how to use it? Well, explore game design. So I've been teaching game design for about 3 or 4 years. This is sort of some of the team here. This is my sort of jack of all trades for Unity. This is my lead artist. Here's another artist. Here's a really good 3D sculptor in ZBrush, which is a tool that's used a lot in games. And so over time I've managed, because game design was not getting taught anywhere else at the U of A. And then I looked at the SEC. Game design is not being taught at major state schools like in the SEC. I discovered that it's being taught like at Michigan State, at Wisconsin. There's some pretty good game programs. In terms of major state schools, there's like what's going on. I found that very interesting. And so I decided that I was going to pursue that. Okay, we'll offer game design. We'll see how, and everyone wants to take it. So I got this much space in my lab. I'm like, administration, this wall needs to come down because I got all this interest. Okay, that wall comes down. Then another wall comes down. And I'm in this glassed-in lab that, handles about 20 people at a time, way in violation of the fire code. Way. No, they came and were very upset. We had shit plugged in all over the place. And so blew some wall fuses and we had to reconfigure. But anyhow, this is part of, to me, what's going on institutionally, which may be of interest, I think. And that is the game engine subsumes all these disciplines. If you're going to make something in it, you're going to need an interface designer, you're going to need graphic artists, and somebody who's good at math, computer science, drama, film, music, they all go into a game. Well, you can see maybe why that's politically a big deal at a state school. I mean, all those departments are going to have to cooperate about something, right? Which is not an easy task. So if you think, why isn't there game design at these schools? It's certainly not in the best interest of the students not to have it, right? It's really in their best interest to have it. Okay, so it's institutionally hard. But if you take steps to do it, I think you get some benefit out of it, and that is, we happen to call ourselves Tesseract because the kids thought that was a great name. The provost was not sold on it at all, so we had a long, year-long wait out with the provost where we just kept doing it, calling ourselves that, until she gave up. So, but it's very cool because it enabled us, for instance, in this one game that we made, to hide a TARDIS in the levels that kids could find. Maybe super rewarded if they found it in the bottom of the well in the Roman Forum or something. And so, anyhow, this is our logo. And these are the kinds of things that all these disciplines are represented in the game design course. I then use that labor to build these things. That is, it seems to me a very bad idea for us as educational institutions to farm this out to professional game companies. No big one will be interested. Only little ones will be interested in it. They'll be removed. They don't have the commitment to the content. Why don't we have our own students do the majority of the building of this content? Because if you do, they have to look at what they're building very carefully. Exactly how is this room decorated? Exactly how many amphorae are there in ancient Rome, and when, and what kind? They have to research all that to build the stuff. And so it paradoxically is quite hands-on in terms of research and asset creation, Also in terms of doing something like the narrative or story for the game, the level design. Okay, so I think it's very, very cool to bring them into that process. And what we build out of this is kind of on hiatus while I figured out what the heck I was doing with the game engine. Now I think this is going to come back a lot stronger in terms of the interface that's possible. Online courses, we'll look at a couple examples. A 10th Street studio in New York, which was the first purpose-built art studio. We visualized that. Not great. It's really pretty terrible, but it's a start. Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, they've actually hired us to build an application whereby you can sort of go into that gallery and hang the artwork where you think it should go. And so this is a tool with which to teach high school students in an online course, sort of, okay, why these paintings, in which order, what tags do you give them, and how do you light them? Why? Like, what are the curatorial choices behind that? And so that's that application. So that's what we're doing there. And this is our sort of, I have 4 full-time employees, and there's a lot of mystery at the U of A about how I made this happen. Mystery. So, I have, actually, this guy's now, he's not a programming lead anymore. He's a full-time, I mean, he's doing that, but he's a full-time employee now. I've got about 14, it varies between 10 to 14 undergraduate students who build a bunch of stuff and they kind of cycle in and out. One of our students is now working for Amazon, another working for in-flight simulation at Boeing, another one working for Google. The skill set that emerges from this is extremely valuable. So I think it's a really important thing to do. Here are some courses that we built, and then I'll be done. And that is an online course that's game-based classical mythology. And here you can see some of the efforts in ZBrush to like to build Hercules. It's pretty cool. And this is not the finished product, but the lion head is taking shape. Built a Fury, which I think is really, really cool. It's an architecture student who modeled one of the Furies for use at the Oresteia level. And then Hermes has to rescue the sinews of Zeus. That gets stolen at one point. And the whole thing is based around the house of Octavius Cordio. Could you believe it? And so the kids playing the course or taking the course enter mythology through the artwork and also things like recipes and plants that are in the house. And so it's a very myth is everywhere. You can say that in a course, but that's different than them having to experience it everywhere in a playable environment. So that's our owner of the house who's kind of looking pretty mean right now, Octavius Cordio. Okay, and then there's even a tavern and stuff. Then Roman Civ course, which is our most recent. This one was a real labor of love and also very difficult. It's been taught one time to about 150 kids. We went to Rome in January because trying to explain how Rome works spatially to kids who've never been there is really hard. So I took a design team over there of some full-time employees and some students, and we did a lot of the game design work in Rome, which was one of the coolest courses I've ever taught, like distance or study abroad courses, because there were also undergraduates who had not been to Rome, and it's like, okay, we're going to visit the Baths of Caracalla. You have to come up with gameplay that makes sense in that space. You've done some reading about it, design levels and play and mechanics that might work in that space. I've never had kids quite so actively engaged, and they had to sketch, which makes them nervous, right? Because I can't draw. I'm like, I don't care. I want to see how your game's going to work. And I want to see what your mechanics had to do with what you read and how you think this space works. So I think that worked out quite well, and we got a lot of our gameplay ideas out of that. So it was a good spend, for sure. This is some of the concept art from this particular game. This is the House of the Vestals. And this is, at one point, our lead Vestal Virgin goes down into the Cloaca Maxima and cuts a deal with some gangsters. So it's pretty cool that way. So, and then the whole thing is sort of framed by this late antique scenario where this old grandmother, this Roman grandmother, and you can see our struggles with animation. That's the hard part, animation. Like her hands are inside her body. Pay no mind. And so here are the ancestral busts, behind her, and you enter periods of Roman history through the ancestral bust of this family, the Gaines Fulvia. Okay, so that's sort of the premise of the game. Now we're going to look at just a little snippet of gameplay. I know I've gone on pretty long, but I think I'll quit this one. And we'll look at the other one. So let me just go like this. And we'll log in. Yeah. And the paradox now is we're actually going to play a gameplay level. All nodes, yeah. So this is the Roman Forum, and it's right about 215 BCE, which I think is really cool because no one ever restores it then. it's always at the time of Constantine. Why? Because that's where the evidence is from. So this was a real challenging thing to try to build, was like what was there. A lot of guesswork. You can see, oh, the music that you hear was composed by an honor student. And so even the music and acting, a lot of that's done by students. So it really does pull in a lot of these different disciplines from a student level. And so if you then start to explore the space, I'm not saying it's super accurate, but I'm saying that it's probably accurate enough to give them a sense of being there. And what we need now is like better crowds, fuller crowds, more junk, more animals, all that stuff. And so there's a long way for us to go, but I think it's a really good start. And some of the key stuff, let's go. With you, and then some of the things we did, some key systems for this game was, for instance, the Catena system, which you can't really see at this point because of how we're zoomed, probably. Yeah. Just a sec. The irony being that we're now playing this game, but of course I stopped using the controller. Instead, now I'm using the mouse, because we have to assume that kids are going to be using this kind of scenario, not a PS3 controller. And that was actually a lot of work to sort of get things to work across a lot of different systems. So that's no small task. So is this going to work here? Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So that's and basically what this does is a game system based on your social relationship. So each one of these characters that you know within the game space is tagged with information, like your wife comes tagged with some information about her, and it's all compressed in the screen. But you get the idea. There's a map which shows your location in the form so you can navigate your way around. There's a client-based system which shows you clients that you can assign to different tasks based on the qualities. And so it really is an attempt to model a lot of Roman social systems through gameplay systems. And I think we've done it fairly. Unfortunately, this is a little compressed and hard to see. Your objectives are on the left-hand side for you guys. And so that's basically a start, I think, towards making games that take their tasks seriously as far as like teaching ancient culture. Try to use gameplay systems to model cultural systems, social systems, in a way that kids are encouraged to think critically about those systems and what it was like to live in them. So pretty much that is it. So thanks very much for your attention. And certainly any questions that you have are welcome.
Time, I think. Questions?
Can you talk about some of the time involved in this and a time frame for building some of the components?
The Roman Civ game was about a 9-month build cycle, construction cycle. It was really not enough, so lots of it got rushed. And one of the things that you learn is what has to be delivered. And it's very valuable to go through this with a student work group. They're all from different disciplines, but we have to hit deadlines. And if we're not going to hit a deadline, stuff has to be jettisoned or simplified. And we all make those decisions collectively with a lot of discussion. But that was about a 9-month investment cycle. The mythology game, that one was even more rushed than the other one, but we're reteaching it now this particular semester. And so we're revisiting a lot of that game and tightening it up. I think it's much better the second time through than the first time through. But again, you can't ever regard them as done. You know, there's always pieces you could add. And I think that's one of the beauties of it is maybe we'll decide at some point a particular level is just really weak and jettison it and replace it with another. And so you always have things where you can pull fresh groups of students in to build on what's already happened. And the engine itself evolves a lot. I mean, they don't stand still at all. So you always have to be researching what they will now do. So the investment is really pretty intense. There's no other way around it. But as far as what I do, the energy that surrounds working, like my employees, by the oldest one is 26, so I've got like a 19 to 26-year-old group. They're very motivated and very focused. In some respects, they're more professional than me. which makes a meeting with them really interesting, and especially going from that environment to a faculty meeting. It's a real disconnect. Because like stuff is getting done against a deadline with a fairly significant budget, and other kids are going to play it. This is really important. Other students at Arkansas play the game that students at Arkansas built. This changes the whole dynamic about how they critique. Because you're like, guys, this is a serious endeavor on our part. Like, what do you think? They have all kinds of ideas about gameplay. And most of them expressed fairly politely, which is not always the case in a web environment.
You mentioned all the different skill sets and roles and so forth. So a student comes into this class, they bring what they bring. To what extent are they learning everybody else's job too, or do you set them on what they're good at in the interest of productivity, and they end up coming out of the course knowing that fraction of them?
More A than B. And initially we were teaching, my initial approach to game design was that I would have the kids build games that were based on a classical text of some kind. So we read the Odyssey or the Gilgamesh or Mahabharata, and they made games based on that. Because games are a big deal in all of these works. And so, but I just have decided I need 2 semesters, first of all. And the first semester can't have that. It's too distracting. So the first semester is an overview of the whole pipeline for all the students. And so they learn something of everything. And so we started with them making a board game, we went to a 2D game, and now we're into 3D land. And the thing about game engines is they have progressed to the point where a student can build something that plays in that course of a semester. And they don't have to do a whole bunch of programming to do it. A lot of the programming steps you need are already pre-built. So you drop that script onto that character. You just have to keep track of who's doing it. I mean, it is a system, and they have to think about it systematically, but that's not bad for students. Thinking systematically, it's good, applies. And so they have to think that through, and they have to think about their gameplay level. Is it fun? You know, they ultimately. And the second semester, that includes the text, whatever it is. Then they have to think about, why is Homer fun to read? What is it about the encounter with Nausicaa that's so cool? And part of it is that they're not telling you everything. Homer's very cagey. Nausicaa's very cagey, like Penelope in Training. And so she's very tricky. And that's a form of audience interaction. How does that work in a game-like way? Now, what are you going to do? And so the key to me there is that these kids are learning that the most recent form of interactive narrative has some decided connections with the oldest forms of narrative. And that's huge. That they can see themselves in that line of creating stuff that's cool, puzzling, beguiling, the way that those books are. You know, using this totally different medium. So they got to get both of that, in my opinion. So first is like, here's how you make a game, kids. And that's why Unity is a good choice, because it's got a lot of instructional material. It's comparatively accessible, much more accessible than a game engine of a decade ago. Everything changed about 2007, 2008. In terms of could you teach students this? I'd say before that, no way. But now there's so much drag and drop material that you can get them started really fast. If I can learn some of this stuff, you know, they can do it. But I do feel it's obligatory to send them out the door with a pretty good view of how the whole process works. And then, once they get into semester 2, they do much more group work and they start to naturally fall into their disciplines. But each one of them knows something about what the other one is doing, and that's, in a small game studio, that's exactly what happens. People have to wear multiple hats. So, and it's more fun, and I think it's useful that way. So.
Your Crystal Bridges project reminded me of the University of Iowa Museum had a walkthrough gallery that they did digitally, where you could actually, as the virtual visitor, zoom in on things and read labels and so forth.
Right. Right.
When they had the big flood, all the actual artwork was in warehouses in Chicago, but you could still see the museum.
No, there's so much to be done, yeah.
A visual artifact for a while.
Right. Right, and yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Observing the art, knowing that the building itself was partially underwater.
Right, right. And I think for some of these Pompeian houses, it's much the same. Mm-hmm. Like the House of Pordio is now closed. It was open for a long time. Now it's closed. Some piece fell off, and there was a big concern about the state of the whole thing. And so now it's no, you can't go in. So something like these models can be really critical for introducing people. I think the virtual space is the only space really to see how these houses work. Even though so much of Pompeii, it seems like it's really well preserved, but in fact, you know, the problem for us, or the challenge for us, is to make the experience believable enough, tactile enough. And I think we're still quite a ways away from that, but still, really, there's a lot to be gained by doing it now. Mm-hmm.
This is really fascinating. I'm really curious how you grade them on the final product.
Well,
because it seems like you've got so many objectives,
mm-hmm.
and there's definitely a clear agenda about them understanding a lot about the history of Rome,
mm-hmm.
right? How do you assess it? Is there a strong sense that it's a skills-based course rather than a content-based?
It depends on whether it's the game design class or whether it's the studio. The studio kids are paid by the hour, so there is no grade. And so, but they're like, if they make no effort to connect with their, like, whatever asset, like they did no research, well, that's not good. And so, but usually they in fact do much more than you think they will. And so they're quite, they get quite involved. And it's like the Pompeii project really brought this home. They would, like, as part of that, when I taught a course, Digital Pompeii, which I taught for a while, the kids would get a chunk of a house to build. Like I'd have one team of students, like 8 students, build this house. And so they'd use whatever evidence they could to all online and printing, whatever. Then they'd build it. And then if they went, like on a study abroad to Pompeii, they would literally cry when they actually saw the house. Partly because of the actual state that it's in is so pathetic. And so it really drove home like the effort to recapture it and the loss. You know, and so it was really powerful, but usually their investment is pretty intense. Either whether it's the course or whether they're working in the lab, but working in the studio, usually that you've already picked the ones that are going to do that, and they're pretty solid. They do a lot of research.
The studio, they're sort of pre-vetted.
Yeah, exactly, by the course.
Exactly.
Exactly. So it's definitely like an honor to get hired into the studio. And it's a mixed group, and gender-wise, it's gotten better. You know, the thing about games, like you're going to get 2 girls and 18 guys, and now it's about 60-40. And of course, as time went on, we needed more and more artists. Art's really hard. 3D modeling, texturing, the skill set involved, and the way of looking at things. Another thing, it was another unanticipated benefit. A lot of the students who don't, if they're not from the art school, come in and they're convinced they're not artists. Like they don't draw, like I don't have talent that way. But of course, like 3D modeling looks like a technical skill. So they start modeling something, you know, whatever it is, an alpha or whatever, and that doesn't really look like that. Or they model a landscape, a terrain, and they're like, I want to make this look really good. They start looking at the world in an art-like way, in a way that they haven't done. Which to me is like, well, that's a fundamental service almost to them. Because you can walk, like walking down the street, like, look at that texture. I'm like, yes, how would you do that? And they have to think through the steps. And then starting to think, what, I don't want to necessarily just reflect the world. I need to make my choices to make like a narrative state to support it. That, getting them involved in that process, I think, is extremely important because most of our college careers, like they're all shut out from that process. Like it doesn't matter. I'm like, that's absurd. So to me, doing this has really changed what I think we ought to be doing, teaching-wise.
So my next question, do you think that the students will go on and bring into the field of game design an aspect of like academic rigor when it comes to building these games?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and you can, like, some of the biggest like titles these days, like Assassin's Creed,
yeah.
You know, there's some that's really cool, and it's like all the... At this point with that particular franchise, I'm like, just stop with this game mechanic. It pretty much sucks by this point. Just give us these environments better. Because they're obviously beautiful, but way, way not what you should do with the historical evidence. Now, of course, that's not their thing, that's not their obligation, but they have the means to really make something cool. Just one neighborhood from Florence done accurately would be, like with all that they bring to bear, their millions of dollars, would be so cool. And the kids have that sensibility, like what can be done with this medium. And sometimes it's really close at hand. We're working on Faye Jones' house in Fayetteville, which is, you know, real live, like historical, significant thing. But it's right there. So how do we do it? And their level of investment is really high. So I do think they will bring, you know, what can we do to be academically responsible while like utilizing gameplay? And I think that's a big question, and I think the kids are gonna like tackle it seriously. So sure. Mm-hmm.
In addition to the actual experience of the gameplay and collaborative experience building the game, it seems like there's also a lot of data, creative data or research data that's generated that feeds into the game, and some of that seems like it would be useful in and of itself. So I'm wondering, is there what kind of formats or what is there anything to be done with that data or
there actually I think,
and also is there any issues with using the Unity game engine, which is a proprietary piece of software, I think.
Oh, definitely.
So, yeah.
Unity is definitely proprietary. It's very, one could describe it almost as omnivorous in terms of how it publishes. And so, and they're very, since we've been using it a long time, and I've gone to their conference like continuously since I think 2006, so I know them pretty well. We won a prize. So we got 20 licenses of Unity Pro like in 2010 by winning that prize. That really helped. Like that was my leverage. Like I won the prize, you got to give me the machines. And so that was a helpful thing. But it is definitely proprietary. But because it publishes so widely, you can distribute it across a lot of things like iOS or Android. Obviously, like this building an application like this is a certain way of using it. Certainly on PS4 or whatever, it goes to the web. It goes everywhere. So it's quite something that way. It has a very active user community, and the support is really good from Unity to this point. They're getting pretty damn big now, though. So it's not quite as responsive a company as it used to be, but it's amazing. It was amazing to watch their rise to this world dominating, And their whole mantra was, let's democratize 3D, because when they started, game development was almost entirely on PC. And it was very code heavy and very like it was like discovering a certain thing in the wilderness. Oh my God, you just don't want. So that changed with Unity because they said, let's just use Macs at the front end. Everyone thought they were insane. Our engine will only run on Macs, which of course is most of the creative world. So they immediately bridged that divide between people who were doing music, who were doing graphic arts, and doing film. They saw a game engine for them. Boom. And so because it's cross-platform that way, it's very useful. So it doesn't matter really Mac or PC or whatever. It does both. So that's easy. As far as the data that gets produced, I think there's two kinds. There's the research data itself. Like I had a girl who produced a deck of about 20 PowerPoint slides about a character called Terentia, who was going to be in Arc 3 of this Rome game, looking at all kinds of epitaphs and sculpture about Roman girls 10 to 20. And there's that date. It's sort of a research project. And so we keep that stuff. The other, I think almost the more interesting data from Digital Pompeii is if you do the network topology, like that kind of stuff, which is kind of like a micro GIS, saving that data. Because you get a spatial profile of a room, which is different than the traditional names. And seeing where the art is relative to that spatial profile is really key. It hasn't really been done for Pompeii. So that's, to me, real serious research data. So there's that. The other thing you can track is what spatial choices people make in the virtual world. Like if you put one of these houses online and invite the world to walk through it, you can turn the artwork off or on, pieces of it off or on. You can see where you can do it. And it's crazy, like if you know they're a gamer because they jump through the windows, right? So you get, and you can do it anywhere. So you get a different spatial set of choices for people in the Mideast versus people in Vancouver. Right? How does that start to inform what you think the Roman spatial choices were? So there's some really serious, more or less big data that you could gather because games will track that. And I don't have a good, we struggle with how are we going to back all this up because games produce gigabytes of dreck that old versions and then it crashed and you have to save that. Maybe you can pull out of the trash of that thing something useful over here. So you save all this stuff, it's gigabytes of stuff. I asked our IT people, hey, can we back it up? We just have 7 terabytes right now. And they're like, no! We're like, what is storage is cheap, come on. And so we have gone around with our own IT people about our need for storage. So far, sort of unsuccessfully, and I'm like, are you forcing me to buy off-site? Is that what you really want? So that's kind of where the negotiation is. But it is a major question. And some of it quite relevant to thinking through a place like Pompeii.
Are you able to collect data from actual gameplay
Yeah.
of users that like goes back and sort of
Mhm.
confirms or changes your understanding?
Not as
of
much as we
spaces?
should. Games do that all the time, like real professional ones.
Like in particular, sort of how people move through
Yeah.
these houses and what rooms are destinations and what rooms
Yeah.
are just passed through.
We haven't done that in Pompeii the way that we should. We have done it in our games, like some of the levels for the mythology game. We tested that one, and this is something we tried. We figured it worked. We did it on some users, and then we kind of didn't carry through. It's like we have to get serious with ourselves and say, no, we really have to figure out how we're going to track this. For game level design, it's like there are a bunch of red dots at the base of this cliff. No one is making the jump. Like everybody's dying there. We got to bring the cliff closer so they can actually jump. You know, so like decisions about what might be frustrating to them because of their patterns. You do that in level design a lot. I think the place, you're absolutely right, the place that really could pay off in a research way is in who moves where in Pompeii. And the weird thing about being in Arkansas is that, okay, I could look at this Roman wall painting and do a like visual interest study of that using the same software we use to study retail. Like how does a shelf display attract interest? There's quite sophisticated software for that. We could use the same thing. And so now there's like a very dicey discussion going on between what we're trying to do in digital Pompeii and spatial analysis and what they might want to do inside of Walmart. In terms of like, what's visibly connected with what's a visual interest point, and how do people actually use it, and how do they use it in virtual space?
In your opinion, is that a valid method to contribute to the scholarship of these ancient places?
Oh, absolutely.
Modern
Oh,
gameplay?
yeah. Oh yeah, because it's like, so you have the artwork back on the wall, and a human eye and a human body are involved in assessing it. Now, it's not a Roman one, but I think especially if you can start to figure out who's using it where with what sort of patterns of use, you can start to, this user from this cultural background made these choices, and they're subtly different from this. You're not talking about human cognition like in this. You're starting to talk about cultural cognition in a space. Then that's sort of like, what can we think about Roman choices based on that? I think that's a great way to go, but complex, and you have to build enough houses that are good enough. And I think we're not there yet, frankly. Mm-hmm.
Back to your Hermaphrodite project in the House of the Veti, is there a venue for academics, researchers that exists for publishing a video game project? Is there a venue that exists?
When you say publishing, it sounds like you mean like a peer-reviewed one?
Yeah, or publishing in the traditional sense is not a good term.
I kind of like where we are right now.
I mean, are you happy with where you are right now with that?
Not in terms of the quality of the stuff, because it's always not satisfactory, you know? You always want it to be better, but I kind of like it because I can put anything up on my website, anyone can play it. And I don't have some publisher saying, oh, I don't think you've thought enough about that. And they're like, here it is. And so it's kind of the Wild West still, but there are efforts to like vet models, like I know Bernie Fisher's been involved in
Yeah,
trying.
you mentioned Bernie Fisher's fledgling journal. Is that
Right.
Is that taking off? Or?
I don't know, but you can see why, because I'm at a certain point in my career, you know, where I cannot care. But if I was 30,
track person, you might.
I might care, right? And I want to have, this was actually vetted, and it's like a publication, it's for real, it's serious. I think we probably need to, something like that has to happen in terms of evaluating models. The problem is there's been a lot of conservatism in terms of like, is this model accurate?
Yeah.
Because that's the real thing. A 3D model needs most of all to be accurate. I'm like, no, it doesn't. You could have gameplay in it that is not, like, you don't know how Romans really did stuff, but you can sure use gameplay to think about how they did stuff. And that's extremely useful, but that won't get you a publication.
Yeah, I love your idea that you can use a schematic model that is not accurate, but it accurately represents an idea.
Right. Right. And Chris Johansson at UCLA has done some great work on the forum with very schematic models in Unity. So for sure, it's useful in this kind of, and that's in fact how a lot of game levels start. They're gray box. They like, it's like blown chunks of tofu are arranged to be your game level. How does it work? And so that could be extremely useful in sort of basic mass spatial studies of something ancient, for sure. But it's just getting that towards publication and getting people to accept it. And also, how much of a gatekeeper do you want in place for some ideas? And and to a certain extent, I kind of like it that there's not much of a gatekeeper, but again, that's because I'm not worried about getting tenure because of these 3 publications. And if you're going to invest, as someone said, if you're going to invest all that time to make one of these models and start to hypothesize about like a behavior that might be not some solid, right, but something sort of more conjectural, I can see why that would be anxiety provoking. So, but I don't know if Bernie Fischer is exactly the guy for more game-driven stuff, because he comes from a very strong scanning and artifact, like accuracy-based thing. We kind of need both.
Yeah.
I think we need something that says, yeah, that's a super accurate, and at that level, like conservation-wise, very useful. Then maybe we need something over here that's like, the accuracy of the model is not so important as what we're trying to capture about social behavior within the space. You don't see something that gets both of those.
Yeah.
So, and I would say I don't see anything particularly on the right-hand side that is on the horizon immediately. So, but that's, I mean, you just make it and see what happens.
Well, it seems to me if a schematic model is presented in the traditional way in a print publication, you really have to go out of your way in the text to explain why it's a schematic model. But in a video game experience, it seems to me that the user understands, they get it immediately.
Some do.
The schematic world is okay.
Right. I think it's a quicker path, but of course there's gamers and there's not, and there's various levels of literacy. And that's the other thing is teaching game design has been a complete eye-opener about taking games seriously. Because I played, with my son when I was, when he was a kid and I was a lot younger, and I was cannon fodder because he was really good. But there was a lot of shoot-'em-up games, but some not. But we really, at this point, there are so many great games out there, really incredible, like indie studios. Even some of the big name studios are making some really compelling stuff. Just taking that seriously as to what it might teach you about interface, like how people learn in 3D space, how they feel because of 3D space, all that stuff is there to be leveraged for how we think about and present the past. And so there's a great blog called Playing the Past that is a good one for these kinds of issues, and especially like Roger Travis, who contributes from UConn. Really good writing, a really good assessment of Assassin's Creed, like what's wrong with it in terms of visualizing the past. He's done some great work. So there is a discourse about it, but it's a very young discourse, and again, it raises the question of who gets tenure for writing about that. Right, for how this game works and why it works the way it does, and how that might be X experience in the past. But I think some of the most interesting writing to be done is there, and work to be done is right there. So, and again, it's like, do we wait for some tenured folk to come up with a committee to assess? Oh my God. That's the other thing, working in games and working with kids, the academic world is so slow. It's like to me, it's like, okay. Now my question, for my administration, what's worked for me all the time is, so we're going to do less 3D, right? Looking ahead for decades, we're going to do less, right? The answer is never that. Always we're going to do more 3D, right? And that 3D, all that 3D stuff's going to be made by computer scientists? The answer is obviously no. So to me, there's like an opportunity with this to play offense. Because games are made by all these art and humanities people. Some of the, man, when I went to GDC, the Game Developers Conference for the first time, that was like, there's tons of artists, tons of portfolios, incredible work. And I'm like, there's so much art and creativity surrounding this that we're not even paying any attention to. But that is the world of gaming. And so to trot that forward is like a STEM endeavor, that's not, we can play on that field. We can really play on that field. And we can ask for money. We're totally relevant. And so I think it was caught a lot of the people around me at Arkansas off guard that a classicist would say, no, games. This is going to happen as humanities. But I had a small budget, but persistent. So I just invested it towards that end, and so far, so good. But I do think it's a very powerful case to be made for integrated humanities around game design and game development, because it's like game, that word game, as if it's negative. And I think we're right on the cusp of seeing that word becoming very positive. So that no games, it's not like you're cheapening education. In fact, it's really a complex and very deep discipline. So.
May the force be with you.
Exactly.